For primarily being a martial arts manga channel, it's crazy how long I've gone without actually covering one of the original stories in the genre, Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball played a big part in getting me into fitness and martial arts, as it did for probably millions of others around the world. So it's time to finally acknowledge one of the greatest anime and manga series of all time. What can be said about Dragon Ball that hasn't already been said? I personally don't think there's much left. So this video is more so going to be a collection of thoughts on the series as a whole. I'll be talking a lot about the Frieza saga and the Saiyan sagas because that's where I feel like the story was at its absolute peak. Early Dragon Ball especially was that period of time when the legendary Akira Toriyama really emphasized the martial arts adventure side of the series. The influences from Kung Fu cinema of the time were much more explicit, and it was even reflected in Dragon Ball's much more detailed choreography, at least compared to modern Dragon Ball. Once the Saiyans arrived, the tone felt like it transitioned over to something like spacefaring sci-fi. Notice that the through line of it being adventure was still there, as the characters explored a new planet during the Frieza saga. The search for the Dragon Balls was the original basis for the whole story, and supposedly, Toriyama wanted to end it once they found all 7. But lucky for us, the manga kept going after that and turned into something different, a worldwide sensation. To me, Dragon Ball really found its footing once Master Roshi and Krillin were introduced, and it started getting a lot more into tournament arcs. Its identity is tied to training and fighting increasingly strong opponents, and the training with the Turtle Hermit School is the origin point for all of that. Speaking of tournament arcs, I also think that Dragon Ball popularized, if not outright came up with, the modern renditions of a lot of tropes and story arcs that are now all over the place in Shonen. You wouldn't have the modern version of tournament arcs without Dragon Ball. These days, Goku and Vegeta are the dual protagonists of the series, but I think we should remember that there was a time when the human characters were serious contenders too. Another aspect that's not as common these days is the ki blasts. They felt far more impactful in the older series. They took way longer to charge, which I think is part of why it felt that way. I won't go as far as to say that Z and Super were horrible in comparison though. One of the attacks that feels especially powerful in Z is Vegeta's final flash against Cell. There's also his fight with Broly in Super, where it really felt like they were reminding us that these are martial artists. One of the aspects I love about the entire franchise is how Goku keeps learning from new masters. In Dragon Ball, for example, Goku actually gets trained by God before the final battle of the series. You guys remember when Kami was a big deal? Speaking of his training with Kami, he trains with him twice, the second time being when he learns the art of Ki. And this is an example of another thing Dragon Ball popularized. His second round of training with Kami before facing Piccolo took place over a 3-year time skip, which was probably insane to witness for people who grew up with OGDB. Another thing that's interesting about original Dragon Ball is the physiques. People grew up with Z, and they took a lot of inspiration from Z, but I think the physiques in Dragon Ball are a lot more natty achievable than the ones in Z. And even the figurines reflect that. One of my new favorite fights in Dragon Ball has to be Goku vs Piccolo or Ma Jr. The hands displayed there are immaculate. Goku and the Z Fighters' skills can be shown in the Z movies, Goku vs Cell, and at some points in Goku vs Majin Vegeta. Presentation is an important part of showing a character's true abilities, and with better presentation of the Z Fighters' skills, you won't have people downplaying DB characters in general in the future. Remember, as a kid, Goku and friends surpassed martial artists who held fictional black belt degrees. His level of improv and skill should be shown as outright inhuman in future choreo. I'd love to see that. So after Goku beats Piccolo in the final fight of Dragon Ball, he lets him live. And this choice is part of a small character arc that continues up until the end of the Frieza saga. After the fight with Piccolo ends, Dragon Ball Z begins. From here we all know the story. In any case, Goku letting Piccolo live comes back as a benefit in the Saiyan saga. They work together, first as begrudging allies, and we're introduced to the iconic Special Beam Cannon, so Goku sacrifices himself to save his son and the world again. When I first saw this, it was insane. The protagonist just died a short while after I was introduced to him. But for some reason, the show didn't end, nor did it entirely switch to the next logical choice, which would be Gohan's perspective. Instead, we saw Goku in the other world, and he traveled Snake Way all the way to his next master, King Kai. So then we're introduced to the Kaioken, which is one of my favorite transformations in Dragon Ball. I love transformations that tax their users, because without a trade-off, the transformation becomes a default state and we get stuff like Super Saiyan bargain sales. Once Goku gets back from Otherworld, we get Z Goku. I call him Z Goku because I somewhat agree with the sentiment that Super Goku is flanderized, sending his character backwards because by the end of Z, his arc is pretty much done. I believe part of why people love Ultra Instinct is because it's kind of a return to Goku locking in when he needs to. So he paralyzes Nappa and then we get the Vegeta fight. In the manga, his brief exchange with Nappa is a great example of Toriyama's skill at paneling. Everything was clear and easy to follow, and my personal theory is that this paneling structure helped the animators make things clear when they put it into motion. To this day, it's difficult to find anything that can really match Toriyama's style, and the Saiyan and Frieza arcs are clear demonstrations of his skills as an artist. The first manga I ever bought a physical copy of was Dragon Ball Viz Big Volume 4. From what I remember, it covered Goku vs. Frieza all the way up to Future Trunks' arrival. Reading the same battle after watching it shows just how much filler was added to the anime. The manga feels surprisingly fast-paced and snappy in comparison. The Saiyan and Frieza arcs, in my opinion, were the blueprint for modern shonen as a whole. You could say both of them were really one massive storyline, since the idea of Frieza was set up in the Saiyan saga, which then built up to an entire story arc dedicated to the man himself. Before we even get into talking about Frieza, let's talk about Vegeta. Vegeta to me is the definitive rival character in anime. I'm sure that there were rivals before him, but he's become the standard. Even if he was invented later after a bunch of earlier characters, it's pretty easy to go back and give someone a picture of those early characters by just calling them the Vegeta of their series. Even Piccolo was a villain who joined the hero, and maybe in an alternate timeline, he would have been Goku's main rival, and Vegeta would have been the Piccolo of Dragon Ball. Goku vs. Vegeta was a genre-defining fight. People remember the highlights like Goku using Kaioken to keep up with Vegeta, a character using a taxing transformation to fight against a naturally stronger and faster opponent. And then there's the famous Beam Clash, Kaioken vs. Gallic Gun. This is probably one of the most iconic moments in all of shonen anime, if not all of fiction as a whole. When you think of the phrase Beam Clash, more often than not, this is probably what comes to mind first. If it's not, I'm genuinely curious to see what pops up in your guys' heads instead. The whole thing was a massive battle of attrition. It took everything all the characters had to really defeat Vegeta, and even after being hit with a spirit bomb, he was still alive. Since Goku had experience seeing how letting opponents live benefits him in the long run, he decided to leave Vegeta alive here too. He tried to forgive Raditz earlier on, but that didn't end well. And despite Nappa annihilating all of Goku's friends, he still originally left Nappa alive. He only paralyzed him, which was brutal, but Vegeta was actually the one that killed Nappa. So Vegeta being allowed to live led directly into the next and possibly one of the greatest arcs in all of entertainment, the Frieza Saga. The world of Dragon Ball was expanded tremendously here. The same thing as the Saiyan Saga happens in the Frieza Saga. The Z Fighters have to hold out against people out of their league until a freshly trained, much stronger Goku appears to save them. Frieza is one of the greatest villains in all of anime, if for no other reason than just being the blueprint for so many others. With his multitude of increasingly terrifying forms, to the fact that his final form was surprisingly plain looking, when you find a modern villain like that, you can go and thank Frieza. Plus, he popularized the not even a percent of my power thing. It's the same formula that was established before. Now Goku can not only see, but smack away Frieza's death beams, a force that up until now was guaranteed destruction. Goku's back, and is providing us with a layer of safety again. But the formula of wait for Goku to save us is actually broken in the Frieza Saga, because Frieza is still holding back. It's not a stomp like against the Ginyu Force or Nappa. Remember that for the majority of the fight, Goku was actually on the defensive. No matter what he used, it was never enough. Frieza was originally the one in control, even of Goku. Using the glorious Kaioken x 20 Kamehameha couldn't take him out. This is another example of something that's a little more rare in modern Dragon Ball, Goku's quick thinking. There are still examples of this in Super, like the key landmines in the Tournament of Power, and even him probably inventing the Godbind in Super. But for the most part, he wasn't nearly as tricky as he was in Z, though that might also be me remembering things through rose-tinted glasses. Another reason I love the Frieza Saga especially is because everything still felt extremely weighty. It was like the power levels were just perfect. The height of power here was planetary destruction, so things were still perceptible to our human mind as the audience. Going up to universal and multiversal destruction, to me, just ends up feeling weightless. It's far more powerful, but less impactful. There's a certain range where power levels make sense to our brain. Going too far above it makes things feel too abstract, but the Frieza saga hits the upper limit, so it feels just right. So after Krillin gets blown up from the inside out, something that still sticks with me because of how horrifying it was, a new level of power is achieved. One that basically changes entertainment forever. The skies spit lightning, the entire planet seems to match Goku's rage, and when he snaps, he becomes something new. Chekhov's gun goes off, the prophecy is fulfilled. We all know that this is a Super Saiyan. The way Super Saiyan is presented here, especially the aura, is amazing. It envelops Goku, making him look like something heavenly. I think Ultra Instinct, especially in its first ever appearance, hit the same note. The Cooler movie does the same thing with Super Saiyan. Around this time, it was presented as something that completely turned the fight. As Gohan and Piccolo retreat, Frieza tries to attack them too, but even though we haven't seen any of his feats yet, we're certain that this version of Goku has the upper hand. Also, in the manga, Super Saiyan Goku's speech bubbles switch from round to square and sharp, something that only applied to villains before. You know all those memes about this isn't Goku, it's Kakarot skull emoji, right? I think this is probably the only example of that in the manga, because even Toriyama changed the speech bubbles to show something so drastic. His manner of speaking itself changed. There are some really cool highlights in this final fight, one of my favorite pieces being when Goku charges towards Frieza, misses his initial kick, and then uses his second leg to connect, and then spins so he still lands on his feet. Let's skip over some more and get to the end. The pattern has repeated itself multiple times by now. Goku trains, shows up and beats villains that gave the side characters a tough time, and in the end, chooses to leave the main villain alive. So now the question has to be asked, will it end the same way by letting Frieza live? This villain is the worst of the worst. Everyone before him feared him. Despite everything, Goku leaves him with barely enough energy to live and walks away himself. Remember, by this point, Goku's had evidence in the form of Piccolo and Vegeta that villains can in some way change for the better. But Frieza is not one of those types. Goku really was going to walk away, but the anime version failed to capture the nuance in Goku's expression after incinerating Frieza. I interpret the expression as being a mix of frustration and disappointment. Basically, Goku thinks that it was a waste. Whereas in the anime, he just looks angry that Frieza even tried anything. I think both have their place. They're like side grades instead of upgrades or downgrades. But to me, the expression in the manga is closer to being in line with the pattern that Toriyama established. Frieza willingly chose to break the cycle of being allowed to live and eventually coming around to being an ally. Goku had evidence to show that letting people go would pay off, but this time it didn't. Goku can be described as a flat character, changing the people around him rather than changing much himself. But I think that these arcs presented some development for him. It was basically, he had to figure out who he really was and where he came from, and then understanding and accepting that. If they ever do remake Dragon Ball, I want it to be done by Wit Studios. From what I hear, they're essentially redoing One Piece, and they're also doing a very good job of remaking a classic in the form of Samurai Legend Yaiba right now. I'd also say an ideal endpoint would be either Frieza or Cell sagas. I've heard a lot of people say the Buu arc is where things get a little too crazy, and personally I think Frieza saga is where Goku's individual arc ends. But I wouldn't leave out the Cell saga because it's where a lot of fan favorites are introduced. Plus, Super Saiyan 2 is the point where Gohan masters his explosive power, and you could almost say that him facing Cell is him fighting and surpassing all the previous Z fighters. That arc basically ends with Gohan being set up as Earth's next defender, and Goku saying he really just doesn't want to come back because that would put the Earth in further danger. So let me know what your favorite arc is in all of Dragon Ball, Super and GT included, and why. Also, tell me what you'd like to see as the next big Dragon Ball project. So that's all for this video. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe, all that good stuff, and see you all next time.